Hey, y'all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. A little special edition today. We've already been live once today, but we're going live again because I get to talk to my friend, Rich, who's also the author of this great book, One Betrayal Too Many, Why I Left MAGA. Now, I know some of you are reading the headline of this thing already, and you're like, what do you mean people leave MAGA? I thought nobody ever leaves MAGA. I thought that was a one-way ticket to MAGAville. Well, Rich runs an organization based on his own story and the story of millions of other people who have felt betrayed by this president, by this notion of MAGA. And so, Rich, great to see you. And congratulations on your newly published autobiography, One Betrayal Too Many.
Thank you, Doug. And let me also publicly thank you for writing an endorsement for it. So full disclosure for anyone out there who's watching and listening. It meant a lot to get your blurb and your endorsement for the book. So I just wanted to personally thank you for that, for doing it.
Well, yeah, you are welcome. And I was glad to do it. And man, I mean, I have never opened a book that's gone like 5 pages of endorsements. This thing is well supported. So congratulations. Glad to be part of that. All right, Rich, let's, there's a lot of ways we could talk about this. I was fascinated by one of the stories in the first chapter where you described driving up to Mar-a-Lago in 2020, being a podcaster and an advocate for MAGA, and just before the 2020 election. And you're greeted there, and people recognize you for your podcast. One guy says you're a bit of a hero around here, a bit of a legend or something like that. Like, you're inside the MAGA movement is, I think, a good place to start, because there's a lot of people who are like, I don't know, I vote for Donald Trump, or I ordered a hat from China that says Make America Great Again, and we think that's what MAGA is, which is true. That's not how you were in, though. You were in for a number of years at a whole different level of care and advocacy and thinking about what MAGA is and all that. Can you talk a bit about that, and then how excited you were at that stage? You know, it's a great way to start the book. You talk about how thrilling that was to be at Mar-a-Lago and to meet the people who were there, even though it wasn't Trump. And now you're somebody, I don't know, what are we talking, 6 years later, who's written a book about how you felt betrayed by all of that. So can you just tell us a bit more of that story?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. We really like how we started out the memoir with that story. In 2016, after the election, it was not a case of just seeing people I worked with on the campaign, where I was a grassroots activist and volunteer for the Trump campaign. It wasn't just a matter of good job, see you in 4 years. After that 2016 victory, I got deeper and deeper into the world of MAGA, and I became a pundit. I was writing for a lot of MAGA friendly media. I had bylines in places like Fox News, The Federalist, American Greatness. I wrote for a site called WorldNet Daily, which was the site that originated the Obama birther conspiracy. And I knew that, but I overlooked it because it was more important for me to be this pundit in this good versus evil battle between MAGA and everyone else whom we deemed an existential threat. And I was also a podcaster. I professionally produced a podcast. I was a spokesman and a donor and a member of a well-known local Trump group. So that event at Mar-a-Lago was really the culmination of all of the influence that I was after, because what I really wanted was the president's attention.
Oh,
you know, that's what now, of course, I want the same. I still want the president's attention, albeit for different reasons. Great. But I felt very much when I was in MAGA vindicated and validated and respected and appreciated. And I think that is something that is a really good starting point when trying to understand MAGA, is that I don't refer to MAGA as a cult, for example. I refer to it for what I believe is a more accurate descriptor, which is a community.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Mar-a-Lago really brought out the fact that here I was, this valued member of the MAGA community, where people, to the point where at this this very fancy event, people would stop me and say, "Hey, Rich, I listened to your podcast, or I saw your most recent article. Good job." You couldn't help but be made to feel good when people
Yeah.
recognized you like that.
And I remember from our previous conversations, you weren't a particularly political person before getting into MAGA in 2016. Like you weren't a political pundit, you weren't making your living off of it. Politics wasn't even really the way you saw MAGA. Do I remember that right?
I was somebody who was, I would say, politically lonely in 2015. I thought both parties were the same. I believed that they had failed to represent most Americans. And I felt that the way to restore and save democracy was to destroy it. And Trump came along as this person who, yes, he ran as a Republican, but was an outsider, no government, no military, no political experience. And he seemed like someone who was willing and able to obliterate the established political order. And I would say, even as I mentioned in the memoir, broadly speaking, Doug, I was probably left leaning for the most
Mhm.
part. I would say that I would identify myself as such, that I was a relatively left leaning person, but I was also a very politically ignorant person. So for me, looking at Trump and Make America Great Again, I didn't view it with any kind of nostalgia. I was 39 years old in 2016. I looked at Make America Great Again as very progressive, as very forward facing.
Mm.
After the 2016 election, I even remember calling it the victory, a second kind of founding. So
Mm.
I found myself
Interesting.
around like-minded people. And as I mentioned in certain points, there's a story in the memoir about when I went to a Trump campaign event
Yeah.
to try to determine how to become a volunteer. And at the end of the training, I'm at the bar and there's all these people who were at the event, and it's like we've been friends for years.
Mm.
I felt very, very welcome, and I think that it was reciprocated where people felt like we were part of something bigger than ourselves and we were part of this movement and this cause. And that was so alluring, even more than politics or any ideology
Mm.
about MAGA.
Do you think that was a part of the general loneliness that Americans feel, and how politics tends to uh, sort of accentuate the feeling that we have of not being connected to family and friends and neighbors, or I don't know, each other?
I think so, because I think it's a need for us to have a community. It's not a want. We
Yeah.
have we have a need for a communal existence, and MAGA gave me that sense of belonging and gathering and
Mm.
camaraderie. And it's how I developed, for example, a second family. My
Mm.
MAGA compatriots were my second family, so much so that my MAGA activism often resulted in me neglecting my duties as a parent and as a husband because of my activism.
Mm.
So having a second family where those are individuals who, like at the Mar-a-Lago event, they they vindicate what I would write, what I would say, and I felt like I was on the
Yeah.
wrong side of history, and anybody who was against us, that they were on the wrong side of history, and we were the real Americans, and everybody else they
Yeah.
were the fake Americans. And that very militaristic, militant way of thinking was, and I would argue still is, pervasive across MAGA. And I tried to bring that point out in the book, that
Hmm.
I was afraid of an imaginary they.
Mm.
There's a them. They and the them are trying to
Yeah.
take our guns and trying to indoctrinate our children in the public schools and trying to replace white people with foreigners and brown people. These are some of the beliefs that I held near and dear, and I sincerely believed them, and I knew others who also believed them. So as part of that community, we had a shared purpose. We had a
Mm.
shared enemy of this fictional they.
So in that sense, like that feeling that there was, like, the world should be broken into us versus them, as opposed to what America says it is, which is a collective we. I mean, I feel like we-ism is the alternative to us versus them. Did you already have those feelings of those people and the strong they, or was that being developed as you were spending more time in the MAGA spaces and as a MAGA, influencer yourself, but also being influenced?
I would argue for those who are in MAGA right now that I believe many didn't start out with us versus them. In my case, Doug, yes, I felt disillusioned because of the two-party system, but I didn't view Republicans and Democrats as these existential threats
Mm.
to myself and my family and my country. But being in MAGA, I don't say this as a self-defense because everyone has agency and no one coaxed or coerced me into supporting Trump and MAGA. But I allowed myself to be influenced by a lot of the right-wing MAGA media. And that
I see.
fear-based, the fear and the despair and the rage and the paranoia that I felt in MAGA, a lot of it I came to realize came from the news and information sources
Mm.
that I consumed. And it was when I started to diversify my news and information sources, which is when I started to slowly recognize these cracks in my way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
We call them in the book, there's a wall with bricks.
Mm-hmm.
And I would take a brick out here and I would take a brick out there. And then over time, I took enough bricks out and the wall just fell.
Yeah. And that's not a good feeling. You talk about it in the book. You talk about it in your own story. Like, you didn't just change a political view. There was a reorientation of yourself. There was a loss of a community. There's a feeling of who am I now? I mean, this is what a lot of us have felt like in these recent elections where, look, in 2016, when Trump was elected, I told myself, wow, an unusual thing happened where he pulled off a miracle election that could only happen on one given day in the right set of circumstances. Had to be Hillary Clinton, had to be James Comey, had to be all these bits and pieces. And what a fluke. Then he gets more votes in 2020, scared the bejeebas out of me, but he lost. Then he got more votes again in 2024. And so I've had to say, like, whoa, okay, the world as I was sort of telling myself politically and how people saw themselves was really different than what I was imagining it was. You were having those experiences in 2016 and then meeting these people and then again in 2020. And so you've been through a lot of, sort of like I felt like it was on a tilt-a-whirl. You must have felt like you were in the fun house at the fair.
Yeah, no, I remember really vividly the feelings of elation and exhilaration at winning that 2016 election. I remember, Doug, being up all night and having, because I had been on public record saying that Trump would be the nominee and would win the general election. And it was that night when, all throughout the night into the early morning hours, having people write to me and saying, asking me, how did you know? And you called it, you predicted it. And I felt like there was something that was happening that was on the ground that was being overlooked by a lot of Republicans, Democrats, and the press as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Even right now, talking about it, I recall quite vividly the feelings and the emotions of that night. Now, when I was in MAGA, it was new, it was novel, it was fresh, it was exciting, it was a community, it was communal for me, and being in MAGA shaped my identity and my being and my personhood. And to walk away from that is really frightening because you have to have a self-reckoning in admitting that we had not only been lied to, but that we had allowed ourselves to believe those lies. And I say that as a word of caution to people, because a lot of friends and family are going to see this and they're going to wonder, how do I get my close one out of MAGA? And what I would say, in addition to being patient, is to try to understand that all of us are susceptible to being influenced. In One Betrayal Too Many, throughout so much of the book, what I write about and my time in MAGA, I realized that I had let myself be influenced into that way of thinking. And I always say, Doug, that I qualify this by saying I allowed myself, because I'm a person who ultimately can think for myself. People in MAGA can think for themselves, but we don't change another person.
Yeah.
A person has to change on their own. The change comes from the individual. And thankfully, whatever curiosity that I had had over all my years as a journalist and as a professional, thankfully that curiosity never fully abated. It was but a mere flicker for the years I was in MAGA, but it did not fully extinguish itself, thankfully.
And what Rich is talking about is he's written this book called One Betrayal Too Many. Rich, you have all these endorsements, as I mentioned at the beginning. A lot of those come from former Republicans who were in this movement, many of them who were never really MAGA. I don't know, like Adam Kinzinger, like who voted for Trump every chance he could, but then now didn't see himself part of MAGA. So there's like a real spectrum of people who support the current president, who support MAGA, but don't support this president, Marjorie Taylor Greene types. Like it's a more complex system, MAGAville, than what a lot of people sort of imagine or what the outsider view of it is. Can you talk a little bit about that, like that whole ecosystem and where people are and how they see each other and how confident some folks are and how sort of, I don't know, uncertain other people find themselves to be?
Yeah, we had a number of former members of Congress, Republican members of Congress. Adam wrote the foreword. We had Denver Riggleman. We had Joe Walsh. We had a number of people who are not Republicans also, who work as activists. They're in the nonprofit world. They're pastors. Nod to you on that one as an endorser. And I think that, the book itself, I wrote with several groups in mind.
Okay.
One is in honor of those who have left MAGA. We feature dozens of testimonials at our website at leavingmaga.org. People who, like me, were deep in. They had their reasons for being in, and then they had their reasons for why they left. And everyone went through their epiphany, as I did, as I like to paraphrase Hemingway, gradually and then suddenly all at once. And then they decided to leave. So we also wrote I also wrote the memoir for those who are having doubts right now and maybe are confused. Maybe they're questioning their belief system. Maybe they're realizing that something is amiss in the country, whether it's through tariffs or the Epstein files or what ICE has done, which you are so intimately familiar with all the work that you led in Minnesota recently. You were, Vote Common Good seemed like you were everywhere at the front line of those protests. And I'm confident that there are people in MAGA right now who are quietly having doubts. And I'm confident there are some who have quietly left. And we need a way to give those people an exit ramp and an off ramp and a new community. And as part of that new community, I also wrote, last but not least, the book for friends and family of those who are in MAGA. Something that we do on a weekly basis every Tuesday night is we hold open, free online support groups for friends and family. And we do that and emphasize the language of nonviolence and self-care and self-healing, and people can learn how to better navigate their relationships with their loved ones in MAGA. They can learn how to grieve and mourn some of the loss of friendship and kinship that they've experienced, and also relieve themselves of the pressure of thinking that they have to change another person.
Yeah.
So I am of the belief, and it's what gives me hopefulness and optimism, that I do feel like there are cracks in MAGA right now.
Rich,
And I do think that
I hope I don't.
and I think those chasms are widening.
Yes.
And I think as the schisms and the cracks continue to widen, people are going to just take one brick out here and there, and they're going to take enough out, and that wall is just going to fall.
I hope I don't over describe or misdescribe leaving MAGA, but I often describe it the way we describe Vote Common Good, and that is that what I understand of leaving MAGA, you're not primarily trying to convince people to change their minds. You're trying to encourage people whose minds are already changing. And that's a really different project. I think about our work like that, and I think about it the way a lot of people who work in recovery do their recovery work, where they're not out trying to convince people who have a chemical dependency issue to care that they have a chemical dependency issue or change their mind about that. They're there for people who've said, I think I have a problem and I want someone to be with me in this work. That's a really different posture, because a lot of people who don't experience MAGA or they just are impacted by it ask me all the time. I'm sure they ask you this even more often, which is, well, what do I have to say to get my friend, my family, my neighbor to change their mind? Like what's the thing? As if something like following Trump or republicanism or MAGA is just one thing, and if you just change that one thing, and I'll often say to them, like, well, what would convince someone to change you to be supportive of MAGA? Or it's probably not going to be one thing. How do you talk? Is that a fair way to describe it? That you're not trying to change people's minds, you're there for people whose minds are changing, and what do you say when someone says to you, what can I say to my loved one or coworker that will help change their minds?
I know that it's a big ask of friends and family of those who are MAGA identified to do this, but we encourage friends and family to remain vigilantly patient and to re-engage with their close friends and their loved ones in MAGA, and say to them that if they are ever having doubts themselves, that they can turn to their friends and their loved ones to talk about it without fear of judgment and ostracization and censure and shaming. Because the fear of recrimination is it's real. And it's what might keep someone in MAGA who knows they should leave from leaving, because there is a certain comfort level of being in a community that one has been in for years and has invested themselves in it. And I don't mean, Doug, just financially, but emotionally and personally and politically. So for friends and family, that conversation is one I have a lot. And I always encourage people to attend our support groups, but I also emphasize to them to be really patient. And I'll also give sometimes some tips for them, one of which I learned from you, actually, which was information bartering. I'll read a story that a MAGA person gives me. If the MAGA person reads a story or an article that I provide them, and it's a way of for both people, it's a way of opening the aperture for each individual and have a little bit more of a variety of news and information sources, which is really crucial with the person in MAGA. Because while I won't say that MAGA is the only information siloed group in the country, I would argue, based on my experience, it's probably the most information siloed. I can tell you, Doug, that when I was in MAGA, any information that even remotely refuted the pervasively held mythologies of our group, it was shunned. We kept it out.
Yeah, and you can see how Trump and those around him talk about the media the way they do, and they're constantly, trying to reduce the value of anyone who says something different, where the current administration will say things like, well, you're only asking that question because you're opposed to Donald Trump. Like they put everything into terms that can easily be sort of set aside. And while that's a typical political thing to say, well, who's the source? That's kind of their only argument at some moments, and so that can be really frustrating. I know for a lot of people who feel like they get on the wrong side of of the responsibility of another person's belief and engagement. We've been talking so much in our work about people who are quiet quitting Trump, and what we mean is they just. When you bring up something political with my Trump friends, they'll be like, hey, you know what? Like, I'm just not thinking so much about politics right now, or I'm not paying too much attention to that, or I don't know. They sound like some member of Congress when they're asked about what Donald Trump said. And they're like, I didn't hear him. I don't know what he said. I couldn't speak for him. But people are, I think it's true that many of us who are opposed to what's happening with this administration are more tuned in than people who are supportive of it. That's sort of one of the features of vigilance. But a lot of people are just being like, I don't know. I'm exhausted and I'm out and I don't want to fight this battle so much anymore. Are you finding that with people that you're now meeting who are leaving MAGA, where they're not coming to which you write about so well in your book, and you can talk about what brought you to your place of the final brick being moved, but they've just kind of run out of fuel for all this. Their tank is just empty, and they're like, I just cannot believe we're doing this all over again. And they're supporters. Is that what you're seeing at all?
We are, and I would say that for the ones who right now are in the process of doubting, they're dealing with lies and betrayals, and for the ones who leave, they leave because there was one lie, one betrayal too many. One reason after another that finally got them to a point and at their red line and a line of demarcation that they could no longer support this. We've got a couple, for example, they've been in the news quite a bit, a husband and wife, and the husband was apprehended by ICE.
Yeah.
And these were individuals who were MAGA supporters. And something happened to them. And I know that for a lot of people who might be watching, not to say this judgmentally, but they've had to deal with we told you so, you got what you deserved, you had it coming, you should have known this. But ultimately, what does that really achieve and accomplish, right? If we're going to try to save democracy, when at one time I wanted to destroy it because I felt that the way to save it was to destroy it, I came to realize that it's easier to tear something down than build it up. But if we're going to actually look to save democracy and strengthen it, we need to form unlikely but necessary alliances. So the couples we're meeting, individuals we're meeting, another couple we got to know, they were a husband and wife couple as well. They were MAGA. They left MAGA because the husband is a federal worker. And even though he didn't lose his job, he saw friends and close ones in the federal apparatus lose their jobs.
Wow.
And he came to realize that the only reason they lost their jobs was because of politics. It wasn't because they were doing a bad job. It wasn't because their position wasn't needed. So there are going to be more and more instances like that. And while, Doug, I'm not saying that we coddle anybody, I do think that we can take the high road with people who are in MAGA, whether it's something that affected them or not. But if they're deciding to leave, or they're having doubts and they're wondering if this is a movement they can continue to support, we have to be there for them as a friendly ear, because the more people we peel away from MAGA, the fewer votes MAGA gets in November and beyond.
Okay, so we talked about that a lot in 2020 or 2022, 23. I can't remember when we met, 2022 or 2023, somewhere in there, 2024. I don't know. Somewhere we were talking about this. And then Trump gets more votes. And he got more votes than the other presidential candidate running in 2024. Like, he got the majority of votes of those who voted on or before Election Day. That really shocked me, and I'm wondering how that felt to you, because we haven't really talked about that part since the election. Like, everything in me told me the American people would look at this guy after January 6th, his behavior went out of office, and say no. And yet people said yes. And the majority of voters on that election day said yes to him and no to the other candidate. How are you doing with that? How are you thinking about it?
I mentioned earlier about my prognostication of saying Trump would win in 2016. My prediction for 2024 had been, I felt like there was going to be a wholesale repudiation of MAGA across the country. And I was very wrong about that. It's not the first time that I was wrong, but I was really mistaken. And in the post-electoral post-mortem, I tried to figure out what some of the reasons were that Trump won. And I think, Doug, there are a lot of reasons in no order of priority, and I'm not qualified to give political analysis, but I think mis and disinformation played a humongous role in Kamala losing. And I think that mis and disinformation is really designed for people who are apolitical and are politically indifferent. They don't pay attention. Yeah. And I'm not saying that to question the intelligence or the integrity of disillusioned Americans who don't pay very close attention. But I think there's a reckoning that has to be had, which is, yes, all politicians are sometimes dishonest and prevaricate, and sometimes will just boldly lie, but no one spreads falsehoods like Trump and the Republican Party have. Yeah. And I think if you just tell enough lies, eventually some people come to believe them. And I think that's what happened. And now all the promises that Trump made about stopping wars and about costs being lowered, and he's only going to have the government deport violent criminals. Those same Americans who supported Trump, many of them are now starting to show remorse, and they know that Trump is not keeping his promises, which is why I think this time around in 2024, I'm going to go out and prognosticate again. I think many of the people who supported Trump are going to vote against MAGA.
Right. We were just 2 years too late, or 2 years too early on that. Hey, there's a lot to think about, including the meaning of the word prevaricate. I've never heard that word, and you used it so naturally. That was a great use of a word, which I guess I can infer the meaning of. But well done on that. What does prevaricate mean?
It's basically to hedge. Give a half truth.
Yeah.
Which politicians are, Democratic politicians are, right, of course, likely to do as well. But no one spreads the kind of falsehoods and conspiracies that Trump and the Republican Party do. And that's something that I think, Doug, actually a lot of people in MAGA also know. I think most people in MAGA know deep down that Trump is a dishonest person.
Right.
I do think now.
Did you feel like you knew that back then when you were in? Did you have a sense that because I'll say to some of my Trump supporting friends, like, but his lies, and honestly, they look at me and they're like, what has he ever lied about? So I don't even go down the road with them there, with the people who are like, well, they all lie. Then there's at least a moment, but I just meet so many people who've they couldn't come up with one. Did you think that Trump was a dishonest broker when you were early following or deep in your support?
I knew that there were times that he was not being honest with the American people. I remember thinking about COVID and how he was mismanaging the pandemic. Now, that wasn't enough for me, Doug, to renounce my support for Trump.
Okay.
But I also knew that a lot of what he was saying was doing a disservice to a lot of Americans. And I'm one of these people who, as much as I wish not to admit this, I never thought that COVID was a bioweapon from China to prevent us from winning re-election, but I also didn't take it seriously. And
Oh, mhm.
I knew that Trump was not, even having said that, I knew that he was botching the national response. There's other times in his presidency, for example, Charlottesville.
Yep.
What bothered me about Charlottesville, as much as I am ashamed to admit this, is it wasn't that I was so much upset about the fact that Heather Heyer died and dozens of people were injured. What bothered me about that day and what Trump said is I was worried that Democrats and the press were going to label all of we Trump supporters as neo-Nazis and white supremacists. So my concern had been damage control.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
It hadn't been what happened and what Trump had said, because I knew that what he had said, I didn't defend it. In fact, I even remember privately having conversations with people in MAGA saying, Trump is screwing this up. He's got to get in front of this. So there were moments, privately, COVID, Charlottesville, that I did criticize the president, but never did it publicly, because the orthodoxy within MAGA is such that you do not criticize the leader publicly. And and I know how people are going to maybe interpret that and construe it in a way like, oh, that makes it sound like a cult. But it was that way because we all saw each other as having a bond, and Trump as the person who branded the movement was the titular and is the titular leader of the community. So as the leader of the community, you don't speak out publicly against the leader, because if you do that, then you're exiled.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of being exiled, I work with a lot of Democrats. I think the only alternative to MAGA, because MAGA has taken over the Republican Party, is the other party. And I also hold to a lot of the things Democrats hold to, and I've run for office as a Democrat, and I'm in that world. But there's worlds where if I say to people, I voted for George Bush in 2004, 22 years ago, they still hold it against me. They still like, what kind of guy? I mean, basically untrustworthy. How do you experience being in spaces with, Democrats and independents and non-party affiliated people that don't want MAGA as a MAGA guy? I mean, I get to at least put 2 decades behind me. How are you responded to?
I understand how so many who have opposed MAGA feel their own trauma as a result of what's happened over the last 10 plus years. Most people I meet who are Democratic or left-leaning are very supportive of what we're doing. They are supportive of myself and my story. But there are also instances where people will say that it's hard to trust somebody who was in MAGA, that, deep down, someone who supported MAGA supported it because of the racism or the bigotry or the misogyny or the homophobia or the xenophobia. And I don't doubt, Doug, that that's true of some people in MAGA. But I think that most people in MAGA deep down are good people. There is a goodness in them. And for friends and family, I always try to get them to remember the person they knew before Trump and MAGA came on the political scene. And a lot of the comments I receive that are not supportive from people who are, let's say, left-leaning, they tend to be almost always online. And as I like to say, being online is not representative of real life.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's representative of the electorate as a whole. Even people in MAGA I encounter online who make all kinds of comments against me, some of which are just your basic, you were never really MAGA, you were
Yeah.
never really a Trump voter, and then some that are much more mean-spirited, homophobic, these kinds of comments that I get. I don't think that most people in MAGA would feel that way about me. I think they would look at me as misguided. I think someone
Mhm.
who's deep in MAGA right now would look at me and say that, how could you have been MAGA and then say that you left? It's not possible to want to leave. Don't you want to make America great again? And everybody wants, I think most Americans, Doug, want to make America great. It's the again part though that tends to, where
Yeah.
we tend to get hung up a little bit on that. And I'm thankful for those who have never been MAGA, who have welcomed me into the
Yeah.
fold,
Sure.
in their Big Ten open pavilion.
What do you think of Marjorie Taylor Greene's move to become anti-Trump because she's true MAGA? How are you reading all that? Did you see that coming? I mean, I'll just tell you, if we had a year and a half ago said, well, what'll happen by March of 2026? Trump will have launched military actions in 8
Yeah,
nations. There will be tariffs
right.
galore. He will have botched what he's wanted to do with ICE. The economy will be in shambles. The Epstein files will be out, and they're covering him up. And he's the most named person other than Jeffrey Epstein in the files. And Marjorie Taylor Greene left Congress and has turned fully against Donald Trump. Like a lot of that wouldn't have been on my bingo card. What do you think of what she represents and how she represents it? And do you think that's a part of? Do you think there's a part of some of the MAGA people for whom your pathway wouldn't be the ramp they would take? They're going to go up an exit or two and take the Marjorie Taylor Greene way out of this thing.
I'm definitely encouraged by what she said. My fear and my concern is that she has not walked away from the politics that Trump and MAGA espouse. Basically being against Trump, but because he's not MAGA enough.
Yeah.
And I look at her with an open mind. I've been seeing a lot online recently, comments from people saying I was a 3-time Trump voter. I was MAGA. I'm out. Trump doesn't speak for me anymore. He doesn't. I don't feel he represents me anymore. And then I'll look at their profiles, and there's something on there about anti-vax, or there's something on there, supporting ICE, and while I'm heartened by moving away from Trump, the key is we have to show people the exit ramp out of the Make America Great Again right wing MAGA politics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where I
Very
fear
well
that
said.
Margie Taylor Greene is still stuck on that. But the fact that she's gone against the president is a very good first start.
Yeah. It'll be interesting if she runs for president, which I think she's doing. And she's going to be seeking the Republican nomination on the never Trumper MAGA side, or not now Trumper MAGA side, or however she's going to frame it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the book. I've written a bunch of books. You've written this. Have you written other books?
This is first one, and as I joked with my publisher, first and last. But I don't really mean the last part. It's just our in joke.
Yeah, one and done kind of thing, like a marathon runner. Books are a unique way to tell a story or to communicate an idea. They have a structure to them. There's an agreement you make with the reader about how a chapter is going to move and how long a chapter should be and how many there should be. So there's all these constraints that go into it. And it really helps in a lot of ways clarify thinking and clarify your mind and lay something out for readers. And it does a story in a certain way that's really different than a conversation or different than a documentary or some other way that people take in information. In addition to all of that, whatever goes into the book structure and making and editing process, and your voice is in there, but it's done in such a I can now say it's almost an AI way of taking someone's ideas, right? Like it's so purely edited, and every sentence kind of holds together because editors are good editors and writers are good writers. So it's very consistent and all of that. Why do you think someone might benefit from spending a few hours in the book format of this idea if they're contemplating that this is an important topic for them?
I say for those who are in MAGA that I say this every day on my social media, today's a stellar day to leave MAGA. And I always say, as far as my personal story about leaving MAGA was good for my soul, my psyche, and my mental health. And what I really want people to come into reading the book with the open mind is that there were some good reasons, I believe, for supporting this movement originally and initially. Try to, in a way, humanize their friends and relatives who fell prey to this movement, and give people a redemption story. A story that of someone who did change, who changed his mind. There are other stories in the book. At the end of the book, there are 6 other stories of our leaders who decided to leave as well, and show people that it is actually possible to change and that it is possible to walk away from MAGA. And yes, it was a very tumultuous year of heaven and hell for me. It's what I call that period of time when I was in and I was out. I would look at a photo of Mar-a-Lago and the event that I went to, and I would think this is the right place for me, being in MAGA. And then I would listen to the president lying again about the stolen election, telling his supporters that they were disenfranchised. I knew that he was just traumatizing his supporters over and over again. And I would say, no, I can't support this anymore. The final brick for me was the Uvalde, Texas school shooting on May 24th, 2022. That was the day that I decided to quietly leave MAGA, and it was in August that I went public. So I want people to see these road to Damascus moments where, like Saul, the scales fall from the eyes, and that their friends and loved ones are not gone, that those relationships can be resurrected. So I ultimately wrote it for the people who have left, for the ones who have doubts in MAGA, and for friends and family. And I want the book to be a lifeline for all of those groups, and hope that it's a work that we in the community can use to further bind and unite all of us.
Yeah. And it's kind of a subtle, I mean, it could be a unsubtle way, I guess, to send a message. But if you asked your friend, if you have a MAGA friend or a family member, hey, I've heard about this book, there's these people, would you be interested in ever looking at that book? Like that's just one of those offerings that could be made. That's a little different than, can I send you a video, or can I send you a meme, or can I put you on an email list where emails are written in multiple fonts with different colors, all the stuff that we all do. Sometimes just offering to someone a biography can be a real avenue into them feeling like they're not totally alone.
And there are other books out there, Doug, from, for example, people who were Republican operatives, who were in the movement and then left. And those books are all valuable. Yes, I was a volunteer on the 16 and 20 campaigns. In 2016, I even wrote part of the call script for the Trump campaign. But I wasn't someone who was well known throughout the Trump administration. I was just a regular guy who got swept up in the excitement of this, only to realize after leaving that I was always in these perpetual states of fear and rage and despair and paranoia. And
Mm,
I want people to see that their friends and family who are wrapped up in this and got entangled in it as well, that we need to give them, we need to try to show them support for
mm,
when they start to have their doubts, because I believe that there are so many in MAGA who, if they're not right now having those doubts, they're going to start having them. And if this book can be something that encourages people to listen to those doubts and encourages them to listen to their conscience, that's the greatest accolade
mm.
we could possibly ask
Yeah, right
for.
on. That's great. In the people you were in with in 2016, other people writing articles, the people you met at Mar-a-Lago, you keep up with any of those folks? Are some of those people on your same path? Do you ever hear from them? Well, how does all that sit?
Unfortunately, I lost a lot of those relationships. It's when you leave MAGA, and I always feel like I'm sounding like a hypocrite saying this, but I try to be clear and qualify it. I think that when you leave MAGA, it's hard to keep those relationships because I became, by leaving, one of the they, one of the them.
Mm,
I'm no longer, not that I'm a Democrat. I don't belong to any party. I'm a registered independent. But when you leave MAGA, you then become one of the existential threats and
yeah.
enemies. And it's hard to have a relationship with others who think that way. That's what I used to think. If I had met you, Doug, when I was in MAGA and I was introduced to you and your work, I would have said that Doug and Vote Common Good are anti-American existential threats to my life, my livelihood, my family, and my country. That's what I would have thought. Every time I do a public talk, I always apologize to people. And that's this the chance to be with you gives me an opportunity to apologize to others out there for
Mm,
my activism in MAGA and the fact that I helped Trump tear asunder
yeah.
millions of relationships in
Mm,
households, in places of worship, in communities. I was culpable in amplifying conspiracy theories. And the
mm,
memoir and leaving MAGA, our organization, it's a way for us to try to undo
yeah.
that
Yeah.
and to try to make amends for my past.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the work that you are doing, and also an encouragement for people that are not MAGA to not just do a mirror image of it, right? Because how you described how you would have seen someone doing the work that I do from that vantage point you had, it's easy to see for a lot of us to see ourselves as thinking that MAGA is anti-American, that MAGA is an existential threat to our well-being in this country, that they are a they and not a we, and that when we say we, the people, we don't include the MAGA crowd in it. And this is the real struggle with America is
Yeah.
we can't, this idea that like we are going to take America back for us, like taking it back from whom? I mean, from other Americans? I mean, we either are a we the people or we're an us versus them. And it's really hard. We do our, you've been around, we do our anti-Christian nationalism training stuff. And I have to say to people like, do you think people who are Christian nationalists are also Americans? Do you think someone could be a Christian nationalist and be the Speaker of the House of Representatives? Because we have one, and I think he's an American, and he is a real American. But it's very easy to just say, no, 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 no. There's MAGA is built around us versus them, and we're built around us versus them, and our us is better than them. And I don't know. I feel like both of those are underestimated. I mean, it's very American, but it also underestimates what I think we're up to. I hope we're up to. I would dream that we're up to as Americans. Do you have any thoughts about like what the antidote to all of this is and how the anti-MAGA people need to think about what it means to be a we?
I think if a pro MAGA person and an anti MAGA person got together and actually had a conversation, what they would both discover is that there's more agreement than disagreement. And, There's agreement on wanting economic opportunity and good schools for our kids and a safe and secure country. Now, we can have disagreements, which is part of a healthy democracy, on the solutions and how we achieve some of these goals. But if we realize that, not to sound conspiratorial, but
Mm-hmm.
there are some who benefit from us being divided. And division is unfortunately very
Mm-hmm.
lucrative and it's rewarded. So I think the antidote of people trying to engage those with whom they disagree, even though we're not inclined to do that because of all the
Mm-hmm.
trauma that our country has endured over the last many years, it's still the best antidote to
Yeah.
taking the brick out of the wall of us versus them. And if
Yeah.
we take enough of those bricks out, that wall will collapse. But it
Yeah.
requires everybody to do a little bit, including the ones who right now are exhausted and feel like, well, why do I need to reach out to the MAGA person? I'm not the one who supported Trump. That's
Yeah.
a fair point, and I understand that perspective. But I'll come back again, Doug. If we're going to save democracy and strengthen it, it's going to require unlikely but necessary
Yeah.
alliances. And I see those who leave MAGA. I want anti-MAGA people to welcome them
Yeah.
into the Democratic fold.
Yeah, and generosity is probably the key to that, right? Yes, like no, you shouldn't have to, so be generous instead, right? Like do it.
Empathy is really crucial
Yep.
in this big, broader conversation. And I hope that'll come out in the memoir, that I think
Oh, it
showing
does.
empathy to our MAGA friends and family, it's one of the ways that we don't change them, but give them a chance to listen to their own doubts when they start to have them.
Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what, the one thing that's hard, and I have a friend who we've had a bit of a fracture in our relationship since the 2024 election, but we did a red hat, blue hat podcast conversation together. He's a Trump supporter. I'm not. We're both pastors. I've known him when I was in college and he was in high school, so we've known each other a very long time. And we would talk about things. What was very hard, and this is true with a lot of my MAGA, real hardcore Trump supporting friends, is the things that he would say that he opposes about me or people like me were fictions that he and MAGA people would make up about people like me and Democrats, and they were not true, and they were not things I would say about myself. The things that I would critique MAGA about were things that MAGA people would say and that Donald Trump would advocate for, and they were actually the self-defining, self-describing characteristics. And it was very hard because I felt like, and I know everybody sort of seems this way, but he was like, yeah, but the thing I think that you're a communist and you want, and he would go into all this stuff, right? And I'd be like, no, I'm not. And he would say, well, yes, you are. And I'd be like, okay, then, and I never called him a racist because he's not a racist or something. I would just say, I think, Donald Trump said that he believes that immigrants are polluting the bloodstream of America. Because Donald Trump said, I think they're polluting the bloodstream of America.
Right.
And then he would think that would be rationale for saying that, well, you think, and that he would make up something. And it was very hard. Do you experience that in your old times in MAGA? Like, was there kind of a way in which there was, I don't know, did you feel that people opposed to MAGA were just making up things and attributing it to MAGA? Or that, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about any of that? I don't even know how to frame that question. It just makes me so nuts. I lose my thinking when I think about it.
I think it comes back again to the imaginary they and them. The ones who I used to think who were Democrats and liberals and progressives, that they were, there was a devilish communist or socialist or progressive behind every tree. And the language that I employed, use in my articles and in my podcast, Doug, was just abhorrent and reprehensible. Calling Democrats domestic terrorists, calling them malignant. This is the this is the kind of language that I trafficked in. And when I diversified my news and information sources, I started to slowly realize that I had caricatured Democrats and liberals into people who they really weren't. They weren't coming for our guns. They weren't trying to indoctrinate our kids in the public schools. They weren't trying to replace white people with brown people. And it wasn't that I just realized this and said, "Okay, I'm out."
Yeah.
It was that year of heaven and hell where, and during that time, I had to come to this liberating but painful realization that I had been wrong about a group comprised of tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to better see that Trump and MAGA exploit and manipulate people's normal fears and natural concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that people are exploited or manipulated because they lack intelligence or they lack integrity. I just think the people we're around, the information sources, they influence us. And I want my story to be a cautionary tale, just as I write in the memoir, that people are susceptible to being influenced. We're vulnerable to it.
Yep. Yep.
And those who are in MAGA now, for whatever reason or reasons, they were vulnerable to it. A friend of ours, Reverend Scarborough, she always would say to me, "Don't ask what's wrong with someone. Ask what happened to you."
Yeah.
Instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you.
Yeah.
And we start to see that people's upbringings and trauma and moments of their life, for some people, we were ready-made. I went through familial and economic trauma, and while I don't say it as a self-defense, I think I was ready-made for MAGA.
Mm-hmm.
I knew people who lost business to other countries, small business owners.
Yep.
So my anger and antipathy was it was all there already for when Trump came on the scene, and he just gave voice to that. And I think it's true for a lot of other people in MAGA.
Well, Rich, thank you for the book. This is Rich Logis' book, One Betrayal Too Many, How I Left MAGA. It's not only a book, it's a movement, and it's a website, and it's a community of people. So I invite you all to find some way to connect with that. leavingmaga.org will be the website that you can connect with Rich and the community through. And Vote Common Good, we do things with Leaving MAGA around the country, and we have a lot of work to do in this coming election cycle. And I can't wait. And Rich, thanks for your friendship. Thanks for the book and for being with us.
Thank you, Doug. It's my pleasure. Thank you for everything you do.
And thanks y'all for being in the chat and all that. And you got a 2-for-1 today. If you've already checked your live stream or your podcast feed, you're gonna get two of them today, which we're really glad about. So.